The courtroom was packed to capacity that morning, sunlight cutting through the tall windows and streaking across rows of wooden benches. Reporters scribbled notes. Locals whispered quietly, drawn in by the rumor that the man on trial wasn't ordinary. The bailiff's voice echoed as he called the next case. Case number 118C, the State versus Michael Turner. Heads turned as the defendant stood. Michael Turner was tall, broad-shouldered and calm, his posture too steady for someone facing criminal charges. He wore a plain charcoal suit, nothing expensive, but the way it fit, neat, sharp, disciplined, gave away a man who understood order. His hands rested on the table, steady and relaxed, the way a man's hands look when he's learned to stay still under pressure. Across the room, Judge Whitmore watched him with the slight smirk of someone already convinced of his guilt. "Mr. Turner," he began, leaning forward, "disturbing the peace, obstructing an officer, and refusing to comply with police orders. That's quite a list." Michael's attorney, a nervous public defender, opened his mouth to speak, but the judge waved him off. "I'm talking to the defendant," he said. "Mr. Turner, care to explain yourself?" Michael didn't flinch. His voice was deep, calm, and measured. "I didn't refuse to comply, Your Honor. I identified myself and followed instructions until one of the officers became aggressive. I only raised my hands to de-escalate." Whitmore chuckled dryly. "De-escalate? You've been watching too many police dramas, son?" A few people in the gallery laughed under their breath. Michael didn't move. He just looked at the judge, expression steady, eyes focused, saying nothing. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the arresting officer's statement clearly says the defendant refused to identify himself. He was standing outside a bank after hours, wearing tactical clothing. He fit the description of a burglary suspect." Michael's attorney started to speak. "Your Honor, my client was returning from a memorial event for veterans. He's a former Marine sniper." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "Former Marine sniper?" he repeated, leaning back. "And now you're standing here because you couldn't follow a few simple orders from local police." "I followed them," Michael said quietly. "Until they didn't want me to." The judge arched an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to sound profound?" Michael stayed silent. His stillness filled the space between them, the kind of silence that said more than words could. He wasn't a man trying to defend himself. He was a man who had already decided what was worth defending. Whitmore's smirk deepened. "You know, Mr. Turner, there's something I've learned in all my years on this bench. People who talk about honor and discipline are usually the first to forget it when it no longer serves them." Michael's lawyer whispered, "Please, don't respond." But Michael didn't need the warning. He had no intention of arguing with a man like that. The judge sighed dramatically. "Let's make this simple. You were out of line. The officers did their job. I'll review the reports, but from where I'm sitting, you don't look like the victim here. You look like someone who doesn't know his place." The courtroom went still. Even the air seemed to tighten. Michael looked up, his voice even, his words quiet but unshaken. "With respect, Your Honor, I spent 15 years defending a country where no man has to be told his place." The line hit harder than the judge expected. For a split second, Whitmore blinked, caught off guard, then covered it with a scoff. "Well, congratulations on your service, Mr. Turner. But in this courtroom, your medals don't mean anything." He turned to the clerk. "Next case." But the doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a heavy click, stopping him mid-sentence. A figure in full military uniform stepped through, tall, stern, the kind of presence that silenced a room without trying. His ribbons caught the light as he walked down the aisle. A few people gasped. It took only one glance for everyone to recognize the stars on his shoulder. The general didn't look at anyone else. He walked straight to the defense table and stopped beside Michael Turner. Then, without hesitation, he raised his hand in a sharp, formal salute. The room froze. The reporters stopped writing. The laughter died instantly. Judge Whitmore blinked, confused. "Excuse me, what is the meaning of this?" The general's voice was calm but thunderous in its authority. "Your Honor, I'm General Anthony Graves, commanding officer of the 3rd Marine Division. I came here because I learned that one of my best men, Staff Sergeant Michael Turner, the most decorated sniper in my division's history, is being treated like a criminal." He turned his head toward the gallery, his gaze slicing through the silence. "This man saved 32 soldiers in Helmand Province. He served this country longer than most of us have been alive. And when he came home, he didn't ask for recognition, he asked for peace. Nobody moved. The judge's smirk had vanished completely. Michael didn't look proud or surprised. He just gave the general a small nod, like two men who understood each other without words. General Graves faced the bench again. "You don't have to honor him, Your Honor, but I will." And with that he saluted once more. The courtroom stayed utterly silent. Even Judge Whitmore, a man who thrived on control, could only stare as the weight of what he'd just witnessed settled around him. The man he'd tried to humiliate stood taller now, not because of the salute, but because he'd never needed one to know his worth. No one moved for several seconds after the salute. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the courtroom wall. Even the ceiling fans seemed to hesitate. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, pressing down on every person in the room. The general's hand lowered slowly, his gaze fixed on the judge, who now looked far smaller behind his towering bench. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice suddenly thin. "General, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding here. We appreciate Sergeant Turner's service, but this is a court of law, not a—" The general's tone cut through the air like a clean blade. "Misunderstanding?" He took a measured step forward. "The only misunderstanding I see, Your Honor, is how quickly you forgot what that uniform stands for. I was informed this morning that one of my men was disrespected in your courtroom after already being mistreated by officers in your district. I came here to ensure that didn't happen twice in one day." A murmur spread across the gallery. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. The judge fidgeted, tapping his pen against the desk. "General, this is highly irregular. So is a decorated Marine sniper being dragged into court over fabricated charges," Graves interrupted, his tone calm but unrelenting. "I reviewed the police report myself. It says my man refused to identify himself." "That's a lie. I trained him. He would have identified himself with rank, serial, and reason before an officer even drew breath. But they didn't care who he was. They saw his skin before his service." The words landed like stone. Even Michael's lawyer froze, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Michael sat motionless, his hands folded neatly, his gaze forward. He hadn't asked for this. He'd only wanted the truth to stand without spectacle. But the general had made sure no one in that room would forget the truth again. The judge tried to regain his footing. "General, this is not how the judicial process works. You can't come in here making accusations against my officers, your officers." Graves's tone hardened. "My men are the reason you have officers. My men built the peace your courtroom sits in. They bled for it, died for it, and you'd belittle one of them because his jacket doesn't say Your Honor." Whitmore opened his mouth but closed it again. The courtroom was silent, waiting. Finally, the general turned toward Michael. His voice softened, losing its edge but not its authority. "At ease, Staff Sergeant. You've done enough standing for others in your life. It's time someone stood for you." Michael nodded once quietly. His composure never cracked, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet gratitude, restrained but genuine. The general looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, this man saved an entire squad from being overrun in Sangin. He volunteered for rescue ops no one else would touch. I personally recommended him for the Silver Star. You sit there judging his character from a file. I saw his character in the desert when he carried 2 wounded men across open fire." No one breathed. Whitmore's voice faltered. "I wasn't aware of his record." "That's because you didn't ask," the general said sharply. "You didn't look at the man in front of you. You looked at what you thought you saw." Reporters were scribbling furiously now. Even the bailiff, who had stood like a statue the entire time, looked visibly shaken. Michael finally spoke, his tone even. "General, that's enough." Graves looked at him, then nodded once. "I know, son. But sometimes enough isn't said until someone makes them listen." The judge finally spoke again, his voice subdued. "Mr. Turner, Staff Sergeant Turner, it seems there may have been an oversight. The charges, these circumstances, will need to be reviewed." "Dismissed," the general said firmly, though the authority in his voice made it sound more like an order than a request. Whitmore hesitated, glancing at the room full of eyes waiting for him to speak. "Case dismissed," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The words released the tension like a breaking tide. A collective breath filled the room, but no one dared to applaud. The sound of the gavel felt hollow now. Michael stood. He didn't look at the judge. He simply turned toward the general and gave a respectful nod. The general returned it, crisp and precise, before extending his hand. Michael shook it firmly, their eyes meeting with quiet understanding. As the two men turned to leave, the crowd parted. The reporters didn't shout questions. The silence followed them out like a shadow, one made of respect instead of curiosity. Outside on the courthouse steps, the spring air was cool against the rising heat of whispers behind them. The general exhaled, looking at his former soldier. "You didn't need me to step in. You handled yourself like you always did, with discipline." Michael shook his head slightly. "You showing up wasn't for me, sir. It was for every man who never had anyone walk in that door for them." The general looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "That's why you'll always lead, Turner. Even when you're done fighting." They walked side by side down the steps, quiet, steady, unhurried. Behind them, the courthouse doors swung shut, sealing the echo of the moment inside. A lesson carved into the walls of that courtroom forever. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread. What started as whispers in the courthouse halls had traveled across the city overnight. By sunrise, it was on local news broadcasts. Judge confronted after disrespecting decorated black Marine sniper. Every segment showed the same still frame. General Graves saluting Michael Turner in open court. The entire room frozen behind him. Michael woke to the sound of his phone buzzing non-stop. Missed calls, messages, and voicemails flooded his screen. Reporters, veterans, old comrades from overseas, even strangers thanking him for his service. He ignored most of them. Attention wasn't what he wanted. All he had ever wanted was peace. He sat by the window of his small apartment, the early light spilling across his coffee mug and the worn Marine Corps photo on his table. 6 men stood smiling in that picture, arms slung over shoulders, the desert dust still visible on their fatigues. Only 3 of them were still alive. He traced one of the faces with his thumb, the man who'd saved him after a mission went wrong. Every scar, every ache in his shoulder reminded him of that night. The knock on his door came mid-morning. When he opened it, General Graves stood there, no uniform this time, just a dark jacket and quiet presence. "Morning, son," he said. "You're a hard man to get on the phone." Michael smiled faintly. "Never was much for talking, sir." "I noticed." Graves stepped inside. "You handling the chaos out there?" "If you mean the news, I've been pretending it's not happening," Michael said, gesturing toward the small TV on mute. A news anchor's lips moved under a caption, "Marine hero speaks after courtroom scandal." Graves chuckled. "They'll move on soon enough." "But that judge?" "He won't forget yesterday." Michael poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him. "I wasn't trying to make a point, sir. I just wanted to stand up for myself without making it a fight." Graves took a sip, "And that's exactly why it mattered. You didn't yell, you didn't throw anger around, you stood your ground." "The difference between discipline and pride is knowing when silence says more." Michael nodded slowly. "Still feels strange having everyone talk about it, like it's some kind of headline. I've seen real heroes, sir. Men who didn't come home. Those stories never make it on TV." The general studied him for a moment. "Maybe not. But sometimes, one story opens the door for the others." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the city moved on with its noise and traffic, unaware that a quiet moment of truth had unfolded, just blocks away in a courtroom. After a few minutes, Graves leaned forward. "You know, the Secretary of Defense called me last night. He saw the footage, said it was one of the most powerful things he's ever witnessed, dignity standing next to arrogance. He asked about you." Michael frowned slightly. "What for?" "There's an opening," Graves said. "Veteran Affairs Liaison. They need someone who's lived the life. Someone who understands what it means to serve and to be forgotten after serving." "I told them you were the man for it." Michael leaned back, quiet. "I appreciate that, sir, but I don't know if I'm the kind of man who belongs in an office." Graves smiled faintly. "I said the same thing about leading a sniper team once. Remember how that turned out?" Michael looked out the window, considering. "I don't want power, sir. I just want to make things better." "That's exactly why you should take it," the general said. Later that afternoon, Michael met a small group of veterans at a community center near the river. The old building smelled faintly of coffee and dust, but it was filled with quiet conversation and the low hum of shared history. Some men were missing limbs, some carried invisible wounds, but all of them had the same look in their eyes, steady, tired, loyal. When Michael walked in, a few heads turned. Someone whispered, "That's him." Another said, "The Marine from the news." He didn't like it, but he understood it. They needed a reminder that dignity still had a place in the world. An older man with a cane approached him. "You're Turner, right?" "The sniper?" "Yes, sir." The man extended his hand. "Name's Wallace. I was in Korea. I saw what you did in that courtroom. About time someone stood tall in there. You didn't just do that for yourself, son. You did it for every one of us who's ever been looked at like we didn't belong." Michael shook his hand firmly, humbled. "I didn't think anyone would see it that way." Wallace smiled. "That's the thing about truth, son. People recognize it even when you're not trying to show it." As the evening wore on, Michael sat with them, listening to their stories, laughter mixed with loss, humor softening the edges of memory. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not on a battlefield, not in a courtroom, but among the kind of people who understood him without a word. When he left that night, the sky was clear and the air cool. He stood by the river for a moment, watching the city lights ripple in the water. Somewhere behind him, he could still hear the faint voices of the veterans talking and laughing. He realized that maybe the general was right. Maybe his fight wasn't over. Maybe it had just changed shape. He pulled out his phone and typed a short message to General Graves. "If the offer still stands, I'll do it. But only if we make it about the men who never got their salute." A minute later, the reply came. "That's exactly who it's for." Michael slipped the phone into his pocket, his breath steady as the river breeze brushed his face. He didn't smile, not fully, but there was a quiet peace in his eyes. He wasn't looking for redemption anymore. He was carrying it. 2 weeks later, the courthouse where it all began felt different. The air no longer carried the same smug certainty that used to linger under Judge Whitmore's gavel. Reporters had long moved on, but the people hadn't forgotten. The walls that once echoed with arrogance now held a quiet kind of humility. Inside, proceedings carried on as usual, until that afternoon, when the doors opened and someone familiar stepped through. Michael Turner walked in wearing a navy suit, no longer the defendant but a man there by invitation. The courtroom staff straightened unconsciously as he passed. He was there to observe a hearing for veterans' rights legislation, one of the first initiatives he'd helped push forward in his new role. General Graves had been right. The position fit him in ways Michael never expected. It wasn't about politics. It was about impact, about standing up for those who no longer had the strength to stand for themselves. As he took a seat near the back, his presence drew subtle attention. Some recognized him immediately. Others whispered quietly, unsure. At the front of the courtroom, the same judge sat behind the bench, but this time something in his posture had changed. His shoulders were lower, his tone quieter. The arrogance that had once filled every pause was gone. When the session ended, the judge looked up and caught sight of Michael. The room was nearly empty now, only a few aides packing up papers and the faint shuffle of heels on tile. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, to everyone's quiet surprise, Judge Whitmore stood and walked down from the bench. He approached Michael slowly, no robe of authority to hide behind, just a man facing the consequences of his own pride. "Mr. Turner," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Or should I say, Staff Sergeant Turner?" Michael stood, extending a hand before the judge could say more. "Mr. Turner is fine." Whitmore shook his hand, the gesture firm but awkward. "I owe you an apology. I said things that were beneath the office I hold. I made assumptions I can't take back." Michael nodded once. "You're not the first man to judge me by what I look like, but you might be one of the few willing to face it afterward." The judge let out a slow breath. "What you said that day, it stayed with me. I've sat on this bench for 25 years. Thought I understood authority, but I didn't understand humility. Not until that moment." Michael gave a small nod, not smug, not forgiving, just understanding. "It's never too late to learn it, sir." Whitmore smiled faintly, something almost human returning to his face. "I watched your interview last week. You said respect doesn't need a courtroom to exist. It starts in the mirror. You meant that, didn't you?" "I did," Michael said. "I still do." The judge nodded again, his eyes lowering briefly. "Well, Mr. Turner, I hope someday I can earn the kind of respect you gave without ever asking for it. Michael held his gaze. You already started when you stood up from that bench. The two men shook hands again, this time not as adversaries but as equals. Then the judge turned and walked away, leaving behind an echo that didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like change. Outside, the day was bright and windless. Michael paused on the courthouse steps, the same place he'd stood weeks earlier when everything changed, but this time the air felt lighter. He looked out across the square, where people hurried through their day. Businessmen, parents, veterans selling flags on the corner. The same world, but somehow more awake. His phone buzzed. A message from General Graves. VA bill cleared first vote. You did good, son. Michael smiled faintly. He slipped the phone into his pocket and started walking toward the street where his car was parked. As he passed the Veterans Monument, he stopped and touched one of the engraved names with his fingertips, the name of a friend who hadn't made it back. He stood there for a long moment. Not in sadness, but in gratitude. Every lesson, every scar, every moment of silence in that courtroom had led to this. He finally understood that his battles weren't meant to be fought with rifles anymore. They were meant to be fought with grace, with truth, with presence. As he stepped away, a soft gust of wind rustled the flag above the courthouse. The sound was small but strong, like a quiet salute from a place beyond reach. Michael straightened his shoulders, adjusted his jacket, and kept walking, steady, grounded, unhurried. The city moved around him, unaware that one man's quiet dignity had just reshaped the meaning of respect inside those walls. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some battles once won stay won forever.